Good evening to the Vice Principal Acting Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Education, Professor Sunil Maharaj, our speaker this evening, Professor Johan Labuschagné, members of the UP Executive, Deans and Deputy Deans, Professor Michael Daramola, the head of the Department Chemical Engineering, and our other heads of departments, our academic, professional staff and colleagues, family of Professor Labuschagné, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to welcome you to this inaugural lecture to be presented by Professor Johan Labuschagné. The title of his inaugural lecture is Clay, from Pottery to Supercapacitors and Plasticine Sculptures to LDH Solar Panels. We are indeed privileged to have our Vice Principal Acting Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Education, Professor Sunil Maharaj, to officiate at this inaugural lecture. Please join me now to welcome Professor Maharaj to formally open this event and to introduce the speaker for the evening.
Our speaker, Professor Johan Labuschagné, UP Executives and Senior Management, that includes Deans and Directors, our Acting Dean, Professor Elof of the EBIT Faculty, the HOD Department of Chemical Engineering, Professor Michael Daramola, Chairs of Schools, Heads of Departments, academic professional staff in the faculty and at University of Pretoria. Good evening and welcome to each and every one of you to the inaugural address of Professor Johan Labuschagné. A special word of welcome to Mrs. Antoinette Labuschagné, Professor Johan's wife, and his lovely daughter Elise. I would like to welcome Professor Johan's parents, Mr. Chris and Rosa Labuschagné, and his in-laws, Ms. Charlotte R. Lowe and Mr. Dani Bester. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Professor Labuschagné obtained his bachelor's degree in chemical engineering in 1998 at the University of Pretoria. He started his postgrad research career the following year in the polymer field under the supervision of Professor Walter Foucault. His master's and PhD research were on the flammability of polymers with focus on organometallic-based intumescent flame retardants. His work was patented in 2002, and at the end of 2003, he received his PhD from the University of Pretoria. After completing the experimental part of his PhD, he left academia for industry in August 2002 to pursue a dream opportunity as project leader on a joint industry and South African government-funded commercial research project. He and his team developed and patented a novel process to beneficiation mined raw materials into high-value polymer additives such as synthetic hydrocalcite, double-layered hydroxide. He was appointed as technical director of Nkomasi Chemicals in 2006, a company started to commercialize the newly developed products. A pilot facility was erected in the same year. In 2008, the first material was sold off this pilot plant. During this time, in industry, Professor Labuschagné kept close contact with academia and in particular his supervisor, Professor Foucault, and frequently supplied LDH samples for research into new polymer applications. In 2009, he returned to academia at UP as a senior lecturer. In 2017, he was promoted to associate professor and to full professor in 2021. Since his return, he has been focusing on broadening the patented process to include other LDH materials, developing LDH modification, and the novel LDH applications. In 2017, he received IDC funding to erect a second pilot plant in collaboration with the CSIR, that is the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, to commercialize another LDH clay. And I'm told his daughter Elise loves clay modeling. Please join me to welcome Professor Labuschagné to present his inaugural address. Professor Labuschagné.
Dear Professor Kupe, Maharaj, Elof, Dharamola, colleagues from the university, collaborators, students, graduates, family and friends, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to present this inaugural address. Thank you to all of you for taking the time to be present at this event. This is a special word of appreciation to the Acting Vice Principal, Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Education, Prof. Maharaj, and the Acting Dean for the Faculty of Built Environment, for Engineering, Built Environment and Information Technology, Professor Jan Elof, for the kind introduction. Clay can be many things to many people. For children, plasticine is their world. Artists love terracotta. Collectors have a thing for fine porcelain. And LDH does it for me. Allow me to show you why. Clay is the oldest known ceramic material, and it's been there for ages. In the 14,000 BC, we have already discovered some pottery shards to show us what clay applications looked like in the early days. Today, between 50 and 75% of the current world population lives or works in buildings made with clay. No other earth material has such a wide impact and such an extended use as clays. Clays are soils or rocks made up from soils with particles in the 5 micrometer diameter. That is 5 thousandths of a millimeter or 5 millionths of a meter in size. Typically, clay deposits are not pure and consist of various clay minerals all put together. Clay have the unique property, due to the interaction with water, that their particles behave strangely. They are plastic when wet, and they are coherent, hard, or brittle when dry. And you can see how people started using these. Pure clay minerals are mostly white, but natural clays are colored due to impurities. These impurities can cause the clay to be brown, beige, or red, which is typically from iron oxide or iron-rich minerals, or things like blue if you have copper, or green if you have nickel in the deposit. So let's look at some of the applications. Clays can be used in pottery, stoneware, earthenware, porcelain. You can go through the list: paper, chemical filtering, drilling mud, and catalysts. I must make a special mention to something called modeling clay, and be more specific, polymer clays. Recently, my daughter discovered this material and can't get enough of it. Here's some of her creations. My 7-year-old loves playing with clay. Clays are typically broken up into 2 distinct groups. We can have the cationic clays and the anionic clays. Cationic clays, as the name suggests, have cation as an interlayer to balance the structure. So clays are made up from platelets with their own charge. If the ion in the interlayer is positively charged, we refer to as a cationic clay, and if it's negatively charged, we refer to as an anionic clay. Cationic clays are predominantly found in nature and the most well-known clay minerals. They have different layer arrangements that are used in the names. So you can see we can get 1-to-1 clay ratios, 2-to-1 clay ratios, and 2-to-1 clay ratios, looking at the structure of the layers versus the interlayer. Clays can be found as either natural clay, or we can have it as synthetic clay. As the name suggests, natural clay are used and found in its natural state. And synthetic clays, on the other hand, are man-made. So we make the clays with other raw materials so that the structures are similar or exactly the same, or something like, the natural clay. Natural clays can be used as is, or it can be cleaned, upgraded, treated, or modified, in which we remove some of the impurities or impart some other modification for a specific application. With synthetic clays, the sky's the limit. This brings me to the topic of tonight's presentation, where we're going to talk about hydrotalcite, or in broad, LDHs. So hydrotalcite is part of the hydrotalcite supergroup and also referred to as layered double hydroxides, due to the fact that the layered structure of the clay is made up out of hydroxides. It was first discovered in Norway in 1842, and the first synthetic form was prepared by Feitnacht 100 years later in 1942. The lattice structure is shown at the bottom right, indicating the layered structure with the interlayers. This structure was first defined in 1968, a couple of years after the initial synthesis. Typically, these clays are made up of a 3-to-1 ratio of a divalent metal, magnesium, and a trivalent metal, aluminium, with a counter-ion as carbonate to make sure that the layered structure is balanced in charge. During the 1970s, it's used as catalyst, and medicine, it's used as an antacid called Maalox, led to its commercial synthesis. Here we can see another schematic of the structure, but in a general form. So we are not showing the magnesium and aluminium as the 2- and 3-valent metals and the anion carbonate, but a general 2-valent, 3-valent symbol and A for the anions. As I said, hydrotalcite is made of layers, and these layers are typically brucite-like layers. Brucite being magnesium hydroxide mineral, as we can dig it out of the ground. So in this brucite layer, the magnesium is isomorphically replaced by the aluminium in the lattice. This leads to a charge that is balanced by the anion. Now, low double hydroxides in general still have brucite-like layers, but the divalent and trivalent metals making up these layers are different. They're not magnesium and aluminium. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the periodic table. In this periodic table, there are symbols, squares, rectangles, diamonds, circles around some of the elements. These are all elements, metals, that's been claimed to have been used in the synthesis of different LDH structures. I say claimed because some of these clearly, from other research, doesn't really work. On the right top of the screen, you can see an XRD pattern. This pattern is frequently used in LDH synthesis to identify the species formed. The next thing we can talk about, after we've now discussed the brucite-like layer and its structure and different metals in it, is the interlayer. We can remove the carbonate, which is the most common interlayer ion, from the structure and put other things in there. At the bottom, we can see that we've taken the LDH, removed the black dots, the carbonate, and replaced it with some sort of surfactant, in this case, an anionic surfactant. This now intercalates into the LDH as it sits inside the layers. On the top right, we can see the same principle, but this time the LDH is intercalated with polymer chains as they sit in the interstitial position. My work in this field started in 2002, as Prof. Maharaj suggested, when I started working for Shamat Holdings. Shamat Holdings was a mining company that got involved with Mintec and the CSIR and started looking at the local synthesis of hydrotalcite, a layer double hydroxide. We started this process and developed a technology which we patented in 2006. When I started the company, we were at the lab scale and just started with an 18-liter reactor. So we've gone from a small little beaker to an 18-liter reactor. A couple of years later, 2005 to be exact, we commercialized a 2,420-liter pilot reactor. So we went from 3 kilograms of material to 450 kilograms of LDH per batch, and we could do one batch every 2 days. I'm very proud of this publication. In 2018, we actually published this patented technology. It's quite difficult, seeing that you lose most of the novelty in your patents, and patents are written to be commercially acceptable and with commercial interest, and publications with academic interest. Take note of the figure. In this synthesis, we actually try to optimize the temperature and time of the reaction. You can see on this graph plenty of XRD, many XRD graphs stacked together and grouped by temperature from 120 to 180 degrees Celsius, and in time from 1 to 5 hours. The first peak on the diagram, this one here in all of them, is the peak that indicates the LDH. And you can see increasing temperature, and in a temperature range, increasing the time typically leads to a better yield. And we could achieve a yield of 99.37% at 180 degrees Celsius with a 5-hour reaction time. which is quite phenomenal for a commercial product. The average particle size of the clay was 5 microns. And if you remember, that is spot on to what we have for natural clays. Here I present the process, or the flow diagram, as it was in the patent, and not the nicely drawn aesthetic one that we had in the publication. So how did we achieve this patent? We could produce a novel, we produced the LDH in a novel process. We had a zero effluent, environmentally friendly process. This happened by a well-balanced chemistry. The principles of green chemistry was used for this. You can see that we started with magnesium carbonate, the one raw material, and I'm not showing this on the top line, I'm showing this right at the bottom, also aluminium hydroxide. The novelty in this process was in the second reaction. So if you look at this, you can see that we could recycle the sodium bicarbonate that formed during the process back into the system. We could then use the CO2 from the initial calcination reaction to regenerate the sodium bicarbonate. In this way, having the sodium bicarbonate completely acting as a catalyst, although it strictly is not a catalyst. In the end, we end up with a reaction where we start with run-of-mine magnesium carbonate, aluminium hydroxide, water, and we formed the LDH. This was quite novel in the early 2000s. We then took this technology a little bit further when I came back to the university and looked at forming hydrocalamite, another LDH, but in this case made up of calcium and aluminium with carbonate in the interlayer and not magnesium and aluminium. In this study shown on this presentation, we optimize the reagent ratio, the temperature, the time, the water ratio, the aluminium source, and the mixing, as indicated in the table. We found that the aluminium source was of supreme importance. If you used the wrong aluminium source, we actually had no reaction. So choosing the right aluminium hydroxide for the synthesis was crucial. Another interesting fact from this was that increasing the temperature and the time for reaction was not beneficial like it was for the magnesium aluminium LDH. In this case, going too high in temperature or too long in reaction time actually destroyed the material. This technology, as mentioned by Prof. Maharaj, is currently being commercialized at the CSIR in conjunction with a company called Greenfield Additives. These are some pictures of that process. We've also looked at other green, environmentally friendly techniques to synthesize the LDHs. One of the techniques we tried was mechanochemical synthesis. In this case, we replaced the thermal energy with mechanical energy, as seen on the right bottom. That's a NETCH LME 1 mol. It's a commercial mol. We had the smallest one that they sell, which was a 1 liter internal volume, to actually synthesize these clays. And we were successful again. This slide I showed to you that we could successfully synthesize the magnesium aluminium carbonate LDH. What was important, though, is that we had to age the sample. In these graphs, the heart, the red heart, you can see it was a lady student that did this research. The red heart indicates the correct structure. We had to age the structure so that we could get from an amorphous material with low crystallinity and low LDH yield to an acceptable LDH yield after aging. We were also successful in synthesizing zinc aluminium carbonate and calcium aluminium carbonate LDHs in this method. But what is LDHs if it doesn't have applications? So let's talk about some of the applications that I focused on during my research. And back to my roots. Doing my PhD and my master's in polymer chemistry and polymer science, polymer material science, I immediately looked at LDHs and its polymer applications, or its function as polymer additive. I'm only listing the polymer additive functionalities here, the polymer functionalities here that we have investigated in my research. And I'll go through examples of all of these during the rest of the presentation. But first, to get the LDH, which is an inorganic material, into polymers, which is an organic material, you typically need to modify it. In these two publications, we first investigated modifying only the surface of the LDH, the one on the left, and then also the complete LDH, where we intercalated a surfactant, an organic surfactant, into the interlayer. This helped get polymer compatibility, which was really important. On this slide, I show a publication in which we investigated different modifications of LDH into different polymers. So these slides, that is one polymer, second polymer, third polymer. And the polymers we used was polyethylene, polyvinyl alcohol, and polyvinyl acetate. And not all polymers are the same. We could see from the results that we got different mechanical properties for the different modifications and the clay in the different polymers. In this publication, we show the effect of the clay loading on crystallinity. Right-hand top corner, you can see that 3 different loadings. The first one is no clay, 5% clay, and 10% clay. We run down with temperature, and as we run with temperature for the different loadings, you can see that the crystallinity is changed. The material crystallizes more with an added clay. This also changes the mechanical properties. Typically, crystalline polymers are tougher and stiffer than non-crystalline polymers, although they can become ductile if too crystalline in the end. In this publication, in collaboration with my collaborators at the IPF in Dresden, we looked at the UV stability of different LDHs. In this graph, the SPL0, so that is the top line here, is the neat polymer with no loading. And right at the bottom, going top to bottom, are different polymer loadings with different LDHs. And it's clear that there's a drastic increase if we take from there for a certain loading, the time to degradation of the polymer. The other graphs just show how the degradation peaks on the DSC and the TGA moved. One of the main applications for LDH since the beginning, specifically hydrotalcide, was in the PVC field. Hydrotalcide has been used since the late 1970s as a heat stabilizer in PVC. These 3 publications show our work in that field. Here I show a slide with the LDH as a PVC heat stabilizer. At the bottom and the middle, we have different samples, and what you need to look at is this blackening effect. Top is the PVC, which blackens round about there, and as we change the type of LDH at the same loading, that moves. So yet again, all LDHs are not the same. Right-hand top, I show the neat material, the neat PVC, with the different LDHs for different stability tests that we conducted. And you can see that the stability typically increases and drastically increases with LDH. Right-hand bottom, just another graph showing another static test. In this publication, or these 2 publications actually, we looked at the flame resistance and smoke suppressants that we could get from LDH in PVC. The Mare, the Figra, the peak heat release rate, the peak heat release rate per ignition, those are the 2 bottom graphs on the right. All decrease, which is a good thing in this case, for different LDHs and LDH loading in the polymers. The 2 graphs on the top, one on the left, shows the total heat release rate, and you can clearly see that the neat material burns very quickly and very intensely, so it releases a lot of heat quite quickly. And with the addition of the clay, we drop this heat release rate quite considerably, which is advantageous in flame scenarios. The far right top graph shows smoke release, and we can clearly see that we reduce the smoke release of these polymers, this PVC, quite a lot as well. Next, we also dabbled a bit into using LDH in water treatment. This specific study, done with a co-worker at the university, showed that we could get 85% phenolics recovered out of wastewater by adding LDHs. At the bottom, the temperature scale there just indicates different calcination temperatures for these LDHs to activate it for the application. We also tested to see whether loading plays an effect, and we can see that it clearly tapers off. I want to talk a little bit more and spend a little bit more time on my presentation on the current and future work that we are doing, where we are currently focusing on biofuel catalysis, photocatalysis, photovoltaic behavior, and supercapacitor behavior of LDHs. These 2 pictures, one for a solar cell and one for a supercapacitor, is what I'm talking about. So let's start with the first one, a catalyst for biofuel synthesis. This project was done in collaboration with Prof. Mike Heinrich from our department. The patent shown on the right is a patent where we patented both the technology, the process, and the catalytic behavior of the LDH in this process. The three pictures on the left bottom are of the pilot facility, which is at this University of Pretoria in our chemical engineering laboratories. So with this, we can actually make a bio-oil with low oxygen content from wood waste. This slide shows the product on the left-hand side. This is actually wood vinegar, so we could make either wood vinegar or biofuel, or bio-oil from the synthesis. This slide in the graph in the middle shows us the effect of the catalytic effect of the LDH in the oil. And what I want you to focus on is this ZSM5 catalyst. That is the commercial catalyst currently used to produce biofuel or bio-oils from organic material waste. If you look at this, you can see clearly that the LDH, specifically the magnesium LDH, has got the highest calorific value of the three. We report it as a negative. And if we look at the bottom, we can see that the oxygen content of this one is also the lowest of all the species. So there's a considerable improvement in the catalytic reaction with the use of this catalyst, the LDH as catalyst. Next, I want to talk about the production of hydrogen from water and sunlight. This publication, published earlier this year, we were very privileged that they actually featured our work on the front page of the journal. So there here we're discussing the photocatalytic splitting of water into hydrogen and oxygen with sunlight as catalyst. This was the work done at University of Cape Town. So on the left bottom, we have a solar emitter or solar emulator. This is basically just a sun in your pocket, or sun in the lab, I should rather say. On the left-hand side, you'll see here, there, and there, a clay platelet. So what we've done is we've actually made catalytic platelets covered with this clay. We've submerged it in water, as you can see from that figure. We then bubble a gas through, shine sunlight on it, and collect whatever gases are coming off. And we've actually collected hydrogen. One of my colleagues actually said to me, "Aren't you scared of this? Aren't you scared that your research are going to go up in flames like the Lindenberg?" My response was, well, if that happens and I blow myself up, at least we'll get a Nobel Prize for this. The second last application I want to discuss is LDH, a solar panel. This is work published 2 years ago on this topic. On the left bottom, in 2009, there was a group that postulated that if we use a nanostructured P-type inorganic and sandwich it in between ITO, indium tin oxide, and an electrode, typically an aluminium electrode, we should be able to produce solar energy, to produce electricity from solar energy. This was taken further on the top right when people started making platinum, di-platinum sandwich structures, where the dye is a photoactive dye that interacts with sunlight. And then as the electrons comes off, the titanium dioxide and the platinum helps us collect them and gives us the electric energy. We took this one further and, as shown in the bottom, made a platinum and then replaced the titanium dioxide dye with a LDH made of zinc titanium, and in the interlayer, an organic photoactive dye. Here we can see this in action. You can see, not linked, 0 volt. Then as soon as we link it with light shining on it, we get 20, 21 millivolts. When we actually start blocking the light, we can see the voltage drop again, and there's the voltage going up again. So we actually made a PV cell. And in South Africa, with Eskom and load shedding, I don't think this is too bad. Last application I want to talk about tonight is the current work. We were looking at LDH in energy storage for supercapacitors. This work was carried out last year by one of my final year students. He was actually nominated for a prize on this work as well. So what we did is we took carbon fabric. This is normally woven carbon fiber fabric. We heat treated it, some of them we didn't. We did chemical treatment of the heat treated samples. Some we didn't treat, some we did treat. And then we did LDH deposit on some of the samples where some of the other ones we didn't. We then did cyclic photovoltaimetry to investigate the capacitor behavior of these samples. So I need to spend 2 minutes just talking about a little bit of theory here. But if you need more information, please go read this article of Zhao et al. So what we show in this graph is the cyclic voltammogram trace. Sorry, that's a bit of a tongue tire for me always. So in the red block, we've got an ideal EDLC capacitor. So what are we doing here? We are actually applying a voltage to a system over time. And we're measuring the current as it comes from the system. All that's important for me from this graph, for you to remember, is this green trace. That's the one for a typical carbon material capacitor. So here's our results. These are still preliminary, and the student is currently in the lab getting some more results for us. What is important to note from this is that we can change the photovoltaic graph from the one you saw on the previous slide to something else. Most of these at this stage is not very useful, but some of the LDH ones, like those two, are quite interesting. So with the sulfuric acid treatment, the chemical treatment, we can actually, by adding the cobalt or the iron, modify that trace. And the newest work that we've done, not included here, I only got the results 2 days ago, actually showed that we can increase or decrease this value, which is quite exciting, I must say. I'm not going to take too much more time on my presentation, and I'm not going to thank every person involved in my research. The researchers with which I worked, my collaborators, my students, you are all mentioned on every one of the presentations, and you know who you are. But thank you to all my students, to my department, to the University of Pretoria, my family and friends, and thank you to all of you that's been listening to this presentation. Good night.
Thank you, Professor Labuschagné, for a very informative lecture. In his inaugural lecture, Professor Labuschagné showed us some of his own, his students and collaborators' research in the field of layered double hydroxides, from synthesis and characterization to its common and novel applications. For me, one of the highlights of his lecture is the reference made to the importance of registering patents and the commercialization thereof. For example, the overview given by Professor Labuschagné with regards to the patented synthesis technique he developed to produce synthetic layer double hydroxides, so-called LDHs, in a zero-effluent and environmentally friendly process, leveraging principles of green chemistry, is a case in point. His research career in chemical engineering benefited from his work done on LDHs and went on to produce various forms and types of synthesized anionic clays. These include bimetal clays from magnesium, calcium, zinc, copper, aluminium, and iron, and trimetal LDHs containing magnesium, calcium, zinc, copper, nickel, cobalt, manganese, aluminium, and iron. Furthermore, many of these clays were also modified with various anionic ions. In many of his publications, Professor Labuschagné showed and investigated and described many of the structural, morphological, physical, and chemical properties of these materials in order to better understand its role in the various applications he and his research team investigated. Interesting to note are the novel applications of these synthetic clays, such as heat stabilizers, fire retardants, smoke suppressants in PVC that has been used in industry. Furthermore, it is important to note that he has developed models to help the development of new polymer formulations for PVC mine cables. The use of LDHs in other polymers to impart, e.g. UV stability and improve the mechanical properties of materials, were also highlighted in his lecture. As you might know, energy is one of the primary research focus areas of the EBIT faculty. The research focus of Professor Labuschagné contributes to energy in the large, with the application of the complex materials he's working with in renewable and sustainable energy generation and storage. The fact that this clay can be modified and tailored to be used in renewable energy applications is highlighted in his most recent research. The making of bio-based fuels from wood waste, the possible production of hydrogen fuel via the catalytic splitting of water with sunlight, the potential of this clay in the making of neo-photovoltaic cells, and its application in supercapacitors are to be commended. It is important to mention that in tonight's lecture, there was a clear focus on sustainability. The research trajectory presented by Professor Labuschagné clearly focuses on the principles of green chemistry, environmental considerations, bio-derived fuels, renewable energy, and efficient energy storage. We hope that this research can propose solutions for solving our renewable energy problems. I would like to thank Professor Sunil Maharaj for participating in today's inaugural address, given his many commitments and obligations. Special appreciation goes to the EBIT team under the leadership of our faculty manager and our marketing colleagues. Lastly, we would like to thank Louis Klute Productions for tonight's live broadcast and also for the technical support for the evening. Please be on the lookout for other expert lecture series forthcoming by our esteemed professors at the University of Pretoria and specifically in the Faculty of Engineering, Built Environment and Information Technology. Thank you all for attending this virtual inaugural lecture. Stay healthy, keep safe, and I hope you all have a good evening. Good night.